Don't let their name fool you. The Emperor's Children are one of the most deranged and sadistic groups of space marines to have ever blighted the galaxy. As worshippers of the god of excess Slanesh, they have dedicated their lives to spreading misery and suffering across the physical universe, forever seeking out more extreme forms of sensation, debauchery, and all manner of other things too horrifying or profane for me to speak of here on YouTube. At least in the first minute of the video. I'm just gonna be real with y'all, I'm not trying to get demonetized. But for as horrifying as these guys are, you may be shocked to hear that in a recent novel called Lord of Excess by Rich McCormick, they played an entirely different role than the one we're used to. In fact, the Emperor's Children were actually the good guys for once, and in a shocking turn of events, ended up saving an Imperial world from a gene-stealer cult uprising. Now, to say this is not in character for these sensation-addicted lunatics is a massive understatement. But what exactly happened? What brought them to the world of Serene in the first place? Who was the warband known as the Adored, and who was their leader, Xantine? What convinced them to aid their legion's most ancient and hated enemy? I'm just gonna let you know right now, this story was absolutely wild, and I'm super excited to finally get to share it with y'all. So without further ado, let's dive into the Lord of Excess and learn all about the time the Emperor's Children actually got to be heroes. Kinda sorta, but we'll get into it. But first, a quick shout out to this video's sponsor. Meeting your nutritional goals has never been easier with the help of today's sponsor, Factor, who delivers fresh, never frozen, dietitian-approved meals right to your doorstep. Now, if you know me in real life, you know that I love to cook, but after I started doing YouTube full-time, I just don't have the hours to spare for it like I used to. Factor's meals not only taste amazing, but they save me an enormous amount of time. They're ready in just 2 minutes, and I don't have to worry about prep work, cleanup, actually cooking the meal. Heck, they even cut down my trips to the grocery store each month, which saves me both time and money. And Factor has something for everyone. Whether you're focused on meal plans like Calorie Smart, Keto, Protein Plus, Vegetarian, or even Vegan. They have a rotating menu with over 35 different options and 60 different add-ons each and every week, like breakfast, on-the-go lunches, snacks, and beverages to help you feel good all day long. They're also super flexible. They understand that life can get complicated sometimes, and sticking to a rigid schedule just isn't for everyone. If you need to change up your plan, cancel a week, or put an order on hold, it's no problem. You can pause or reschedule your deliveries anytime. If you want to take control of your nutrition as well as save time and money, then head to factor75.com or click on the link below and use code WesHammer50 to get 50% off your first Factor box and 20% off your next month of orders. That's code WesHammer50 at factor75.com to get 50% off your first box plus 20% off your next month of orders. Big thanks to Factor for sponsoring this video. This story follows the Emperor's Children warband known as the Adored, and right as the story begins, the first thing that we see is their frigate, the Exaltation, getting ripped from the warp and dropped back into real space for unknown reasons. Now, many years ago, the most notable thing that the Adored did was betray Abaddon and the Black Legion, having broken off and escaped from one of his Black Crusades in order to pursue their own objectives. They had been on their way to meet up with other warbands of the Emperor's Children, but now they suddenly found themselves deep in uncharted territory. This is where we are introduced to our main character Xantine, the Lord of the Adored. And I'm just gonna be honest with you, this dude is like the perfect Emperor's Children character. He's dripping with narcissism, pettiness, and he's convinced he's the greatest man to have ever lived. He's just the worst, and I absolutely love him. The narrator gives us this whole speech about how Xantine knows that Abaddon and the rest of the Black Legion for that matter are hunting him down, that such a betrayal would never be forgiven. But Xantine was just too damn clever. He had managed to dodge Abaddon at every turn, zigzagging his way across the galaxy and always being 2 steps ahead of the War Master. Now, whereas Xantine has an incredibly high opinion of himself and his mastery of evasive tactics, the narrator tells us that the very thought that maybe Abaddon simply didn't care about them or even knew who Xantine was had never crossed his mind. Already, we're off to a great start. Xantine looked out of one of the ship's viewports to try to get some bearing on why they dropped from the warp so suddenly, and that's when he saw it, a planet unlike any he had ever seen before. It was a light shade of pink, like a glittering jewel in the void. He felt drawn to it, and he knew in that moment that no matter what it took, he would claim it as his own. However, there's this demon bound inside of him named Sajanth, one of Slaaneish's own personal handmaidens. Now, she's completely against this idea. She sees this as a pointless distraction, but Xantine won't be deterred. Seeking answers, he heads off towards the bridge, where he meets with both his ship's mistress and the Exaltation's navigator, who long ago had mutated into a writhing mound of stinking flesh, whose tendrils now ran through the length of the ship. The ship mistress kicks the thing and demands it tell them why it dropped them from the warp. The navigator quivers and undulates and responds that it didn't. Frankly, it doesn't know what happened, but their warp drives seem to be offline. And due to the complex warp patterns that were currently assailing this area of the void, the system's mandible point would be useless. They were stuck here. The ship mistress then turns to one of her orderlies and demands a full readout from the Auspex scanners. The guy tells her that there was no mention of the nearby planet in any recent Imperial records. But in some of the older lore, there had been references to an agri-world out here, one that apparently was dedicated to producing only a single crop, an ingredient used in expensive rejuvenat treatments across the Imperium. Additionally, they were picking up signs of life on the planet's surface, as well as the telltale markers of what seemed to be either an uprising or some type of civilian unrest. Xantine smiled to himself. Not only was this planet a rare prize that would allow them to restock their stores of weapons, ammunition, and supplies, as well as take a sizable population of new slaves, but it was cut off from the rest of the Imperium, making it a far easier target to raid. You see, the Adored had fallen on some pretty hard times recently, and been reduced to raiding simple mining colonies. Every single time their journey brought them to a valuable world, some other warband had already beaten them there, or disaster had rendered the planet completely useless. After such a string of bad luck, Serene represented the best option for resupplying. But there was something more to it for Xantine. He fancied himself as Slaaneish's gift to the universe. He'd always wondered what it would be like to be king of his own world. Now, he may have been bloodthirsty, that was a given, but he was no tyrant. He would be a fair and noble ruler. The planet could be liberated, its people freed from the drudgery of their lives, and with Xantine as their guide, they would cast off the shackles of ignorance bestowed upon them by the Corpse Emperor. As their supreme ruler, he would lead them into the future. Now, Xantine knew that his brothers wouldn't share his enthusiasm, so he kept that whole supreme leader thing to himself when laying out his plans, choosing instead to focus on the bountiful harvest of supplies and apparently rare narcotics that Serene could provide them. He called upon his Senate, a conclave of the Adored's most exalted members. There was, of course, himself, but also Vavisk, his oldest friend and choirmaster of the Adored's Noise Marines, Corin Tun, a former wordbearer and the Adored's chief diabolist, Sarquil, their quartermaster, Turan Kun, Xantine's champion, and finally a mortal woman named Phaedri, a witch and Xantine's muse who had been by his side offering guidance for many years. He tells his brothers that since he values their guidance so highly, he would leave the decision on whether or not to invade Serene to a vote. Now, in reality, he had recently gone to Vavisk in order to try to win him over to his side, so from his perspective, this vote is more for show than anything else. Now, I love this scene because they're all wearing togas, and they refer to themselves as the Senate, and there's a certain air of philosophy and classiness to this meeting of minds. But then the camera pans out, and they're all sitting on chairs made out of living human slaves, just in case you forgot how messed up the Emperor's children actually are. Now, despite Xantine's enthusiasm, the 6 members of the Senate end up at an impasse. Those who are for invading Serene are, of course, Xantine himself, his muse, and his champion, who, if Xantine was being honest, was only on the council in the first place because he was a glorified yes-man, someone that, although annoying, Xantine believed had their uses. The Diabloist says no because he wants to continue investigating the path of the Great Rift in order to find new exotic types of Neverborn to add to his collection. The Quartermaster says no because their supplies are already running incredibly low. And even if this world could provide them with a refresh to their armory, they didn't have enough ammunition to take an entire planet. It was just impractical. And finally, Vavisk, his oldest friend, who he had fought beside during the Great Crusade and who had saved Xantine more times than he could possibly count, also voted no, a decision that he had not anticipated and the one that hurt him the most. Vavisk wants to continue following the Song of Slaanesh, as he and the Noise Marines believe that when they locate its source, they'll find Fulgrim, who will be convinced to come back to his sons and reform the Emperor's children. This is a dream that Xantine has always found completely nonsensical. The Emperor's children were far too divided and consumed by their own interest to come back together as a legion, but he had humored Vavisk's dreams when it suited him. Not to be deterred, Xantine declares that since the vote is split, he is going to allow the demon inside of him to cast the tiebreaker, something that the entire council is immediately opposed to. But he doesn't care, and he gives his body over to her. In a surprise twist though, after she takes control of him and is now speaking with his voice, she also votes no. But before the decision can be finalized, the entire room is shook with violent force, as it's revealed that the planet-side guns on Serene's surface had fired upon them. The direct hit had knocked out their weapons, shielding, and propulsion systems. The navigator tells them over the Vox that the only chance they have left was to neutralize or destroy their attackers. Now, it's at this point that the story shifts down planet-side, and we get a better look at what's actually going on here, as well as some much-needed background information on the planet itself. Its name was Serene, and its entire population lived in a single hive city, separated into an upper and lower level by a thick layer of chemical smog in the middle. The rest of the planet was dominated by a field of pink grass, each strand 20 feet tall and as thick as a man's head. This was Serene's primary crop, as it contained Solipsis sap, the primary ingredient in rejuvenat treatments across the Imperium. Now, holding the keys figuratively and somewhat literally to eternal youth gave Serene widespread power and influence. But with the destruction of Cadia and the forming of the Great Rift, Serene found itself in Imperium Nihilus, cut off from Terra and the rest of humanity. Whereas before, their void ports were constantly clogged with ships coming from all over, Serene now hadn't seen a single visitor in over 30 years. You would think that something like this would cause Serene to change its ways, but it was far too calcified to shift to a new way of life. Thus, it continued on as if nothing had happened. The majority of the population continued to work the fields and maintain the drug-producing manufactorums, while the wealthy continued their pursuits of luxury. Resentment had always existed in the lower class, but in the farthest down rung of the social hierarchy, down in the fields of grass themselves, this resentment had finally begun to blossom into thoughts of revolution. But these thoughts weren't entirely their own. There was an alien presence here that had existed for centuries, slowly manipulating the population in preparation for this very day. One night, thousands of the field workers felt something calling to them from out in the grass. They all gathered in a makeshift amphitheater where a woman, surrounded by multiple three-armed giants, told them that now was the time to take this world for themselves. For too long, the rich nobles had looked down upon them and hoarded Serene's wealth for themselves, but no longer. Their legends had told them that a savior would come from the stars to deliver them to salvation. But those legends had lied. Their savior instead would come from below. She tells them all to arm themselves and make their way towards the upper spires, for tonight, revolution had come to Serene. We fast forward a little while later, and the workers have poured into the upper city, driven on by a mysterious voice in their mind that compelled them to kill their oppressors, or any other citizens of the lower hives that dared to stand in their way. It was the worst massacre Serene had ever seen. Any who opposed them or were not part of the rebellion were slaughtered in their thousands, dragged from their homes kicking and screaming. It took only a few short days, but the rebels had overtaken much of the upper hive, the planetary leadership retreating into the safety of panic cells and fortified bunkers. The remains of Serene's military were then ordered to stand guard and safeguard these locations, rather than trying to take back the city. The rest of the population would be forced to fend for itself. Now, the story doesn't outright say this until much later in the book, but for all of us who have been into Warhammer for quite some time, it's pretty obvious that Serene is dealing with a gene-stealer cult uprising. What's more, they've taken control of many of the centers of military significance on the planet, including the planet-to-void weapons batteries. The moment they saw a Xantine ship in orbit, they had fired upon it. Okay, so now the story jumps back to Xantine aboard their ship. the Emperor's children have taken significant damage. Most of their major systems on the ship are crippled and the navigator is dead. But before they can make a decision on what to do next, they receive a Vox message from the planet's surface. The guy on the other end of the line is named Piero. I'm not gonna lie to you, he's an awful, terrible little man, and I absolutely love him. You see, he's Serene's vice treasurer, a position that he only got because of the connections his father had. Now, Piero is having a really bad day. First, his favorite manservant, Rogir, was killed by the filthy peasants that crawled their way up from the Undercity. And then he was forced to run for his life. The indignity of it. Can you even imagine? Piero hadn't run anywhere in over 30 years. Piero tells the strangers in orbit that they're under attack from within, that there had been an uprising of heretics and peasants that had turned against the Emperor. They wouldn't survive without aid, and he demands they come down here and save them. There's silence at first, and Piero starts freaking out, making more demands. But eventually, he hears a voice, one that is as cold as ice, asking him if he has any idea who he was speaking to. Piero, all the gravitas from his voice now immediately gone, is like, to be honest, no. Their scanners were having difficulty reading the ship's identifiers. All they knew was that the ship was of Imperial make. Now, Xantine, who is on the other end of the line, gets this twisted little idea in his head that he could have some fun with this. He reveled in the idea of playing a role as a savior figure in some grand theatrical performance. He asked Piero why Serene soldiers couldn't take care of this themselves. Why would Piero get it in his head to call upon the Adeptus Astartes for aid? Now, Piero is completely taken aback by this. He's like, Space Marines? You're a Space Marine vessel? Piero stutters, but he tells him that the remains of their militia were standing by, but he had no idea how many of them were left. When they got to the surface though, the Space Marines could take command of them. Piero would make sure of it. Xantine is like, that's good to hear, but what can you offer us in return for our aid?
Offer you? My lord, please. We are but a simple agri-world. What could we possibly offer to the true children of the Emperor?
Oh, believe me, Piero, we are true children of the Emperor. But you have seen the great rift that blankets the sky. Do you think yours is the only world that suffers, that calls out into the void for aid? The Emperor helps those who help themselves, and we must reach an accord before we're able to provide our services. So I ask again, what can you offer us?
Anything you desire. We have ammunition, we have fuel, we have medicine, take it. And afterwards, when the day is won, I personally will lead the procession in your honor. Just help us.
Then the stage is set. Piero, tell your world to prepare for our arrival. The Emperor's children are coming to save you.
The Vox cut out, and Piero was left sitting there in complete disbelief. The Adeptus Astartes. What were the chances? And not just any chapter of Space Marines, the Emperor's children, no less. Now, of course, he had never heard of that chapter specifically. Come to think of it, he didn't know the names of any specific chapters. They were all so shrouded in secrecy and mystery. But they clearly had to be some of the best Space Marines out there if they bore the Emperor's own name. This was a legendary moment for Piero. It was him who had secured the Astartes' aid after all. A smile crept over his lips, thinking of the power and prestige this would bring him. He would be the savior of Serene, the one man brave enough to call down the angels themselves to deliver this world from damnation. Truly, the Emperor smiled on his favorites. Despite the fact that Xantine's brothers did not want to pursue taking Serene, now that their ship is crippled and they've got some massive guns pointed at them, they don't really have much of a choice. Their attack strategy was simple, one that the Emperor's Children warbands had used across the galaxy since the Legion's early history: the legendary Maruskara, the open and the hidden blade. The hidden blade, responsible for the killing cut, would be wielded by Xantine, whereas the open blade, the initial assault tasked with sowing confusion and panic amongst the enemy, would be led by his champion Tarakon. The open blade's visible show of aggression and force would surprise the enemy leader figures and drive them out of hiding. Once their location could be confirmed, the hidden blade would strike and decapitate them. The first drop pods landed with a thunderous boom, and Tarakon used the momentum to catapult himself out of the opening into an acrobatic roll, the power field around his sword bursting into crackling life. He scanned for enemies and noticed dozens of humanoid shapes moving in the smog all around them. Further off in the distance, he could see individuals mounting heavy stubbers and pointing them in their direction. They had landed smack dab in the middle of the enemy forces. Tarakon leveled his saber and shouted out to the foe.
Behold, mortals, behold my beauty, and behold your death.
He charged in, whipping his blade down in a long arcing cut, his long white hair spinning as he sliced open the stomach of one figure as it tried to rise. Bolters barked as the other warriors of the Adored's initial strike force made their way out of the Dreadclaw. Mutants and cultists alike exploded as bolts buried themselves in bodies, the dust and blood caking the warriors' brightly colored power armor, reducing the vibrant pinks and purples to dull gray and gore red. Tarakon slammed his armored boot down through the chest cavity of an injured man dressed in greasy rags and realized that something was off about these mortals. Many of them had too many arms, and their blood stank of the void. He suddenly realized that he had seen similar creatures before in the gene forges of his creator Fabius Bile. Just as the thought occurred to him, he saw a whole host of multi-limbed aliens charging in from multiple directions.
Gene stealers!
He called out to his brothers just as one of the creatures leapt into the air, scything its talons down in a blow aimed to tear open his ribcage. But Tarakon pirouetted and brought his blade against the beast, carving it in half in midair. As more and more of the creatures poured in, it seemed like the Emperor's children would get quickly overrun. That was until Vavisk and the choir of Noise Marines stepped forward, telling Tarakon to stand back. As one, they leveled their sonic blasters and channeled their infernal sound. The Noise Marine sonic blasters erupted in turn. The wave of noise was so powerful that Tarakon could see it, a visible bow shock that traveled the length of the void port at the speed of sound. It moved through bodies, both chitin and soft flesh, as if they weren't there, bursting eardrums and jellifying bones as it went. Vavis called the cadence of his coterie, sending pulses and shrieks of sound in the midst of the sustained assault. These ripples forced cultists from cover, their eyes, ears, and other orifices pouring with their own blood. The hybrid gene-stealer mutations worked against them, chitinous plates that would normally offer protection against ballistic weapons, increasing the pressure on skulls squeezed from inside. Tarakon watched as one giant mutant's head exploded, bony shards and brain matter ejected backwards across its wailing comrades. The sonic blasters called forth the sound of the warp, and with their sustained fire, the distance between material existence and the Empyrean narrowed. And then, with a final blast of unbearable noise, it was over. Fat little tentacles slapped to the ferrocrete floor, fizzling back into non-existence as the primacy of the material plane reasserted itself once more. The first battle had been won, but there was still more fighting to come. Now, while the Astartes are fighting, just a short distance away is a fortified command tower where Piero and the rest of the political power on Serene are held up. They've been listening to the fighting outside, and now that it appears that the battle has been won, they want to open the doors to greet the Emperor's children. Piero wants to be the first one that they see, since it was him who brought them down in the first place. He pushes his way to the front of the bunker, but of course not going all the way down to the doors themselves, choosing instead to stand at the top of the staircase. It was a little trick his father had taught him. Always give yourself the height advantage during introductions. As he prepared to greet the newcomers, he wondered what they would actually look like. None on Serene had ever actually seen a Space Marine before. They only had statues and frescoes to go off of. He imagined that they would be beautiful, like real angels of legends. The doors began to open, and Piero called out to them, welcoming the Space Marines to Serene, but he's not able to finish the greeting. It died on his lips halfway through, as the first of the Space Marines ducked down under the doorframe to step over the threshold. A gasp of shock rippled through the gathered crowd. The Space Marine was nothing like any of them could have possibly imagined. Its armor was shockingly pink, covered in blood, and adorned with both strange symbols and fetishes of gold and bone. Skins and severed human hands hung from its waist, swaying back and forth as it lumbered into the control center's hallway. All of that was horrifying enough, But the worst of it was the man's face. It looked like he had been made of melting candle wax, held in place loosely by being stapled to his cheekbones. The dude didn't even have a bottom jaw. It had been replaced with an oversized Vox grill that hummed and buzzed as he walked. The one that walked in behind him thankfully looked a lot more to Piero like what he had imagined. He was enormous, taller even than the first Marine, and he was beautiful. He had a face that looked as if it had been carved from marble. He had perfect long white hair, perfect eyes, a perfect nose, and a perfect jawline. He was so perfect, in fact, so symmetrical, that impossibly, Piero found it somehow even harder to look at him than the first guy. They introduced themselves as Vavisk and Tarakon, but all of these mortals would refer to them only as my lord, or Tarakon would dirty his blade with their filthy blood. Piero can't help himself. He mutters the word throne under his breath, and Tarakon's eyes snap to him. He tells him not to dare ever mention that word in his presence again. And Piero thinks to himself, oh my god, how foolish of me. I've insulted them. Clearly, the Emperor's children are one of those super religious and pious chapters that I've read about. I just insulted their faith in the Emperor. I certainly won't make that mistake again. The Space Marines demand to speak to whoever's in charge, and Piero wrongfully assumes that it's him, as he's under the impression that the ruling council has all been killed. But another noble informs him that that's not actually true. There is a fortified bunker deep below the command tower that the planetary governor and the rest of his council had been moved to. Piero is like, if that's true, dude, then why didn't somebody get me and bring me to the bunker? And the guy's just like, your talents were deemed, how do I put this, better suited elsewhere. Tarakon tells them that none of this matters. Take him to the planetary governor immediately. And when they finally arrive, Piero knocked on the door, informing the governor and his council that he had wonderful news. He alone had saved Serene by calling down the angels to aid them. He hears a voice come back from the other side saying that they don't believe him. And Tarakon steps in, saying that they had 6 seconds to open the door or he would cut his way through. Begrudgingly, they oblige, and the group wanders inside. Now, the governor and everyone else in here, just like the nobles from before, are horrified by the Space Marine's appearance. But even worse still is a mortal woman that they had brought with them. There was a deep wrongness about her. As she started moving through the chamber, sniffing the air, looking for something known only to her, she investigated each member of the council one by one, until she found what she was looking for. She sits the man down in one of the chairs and asks him where his leader is hiding. And the guy's like, what are you talking about? The planetary governor is right there. And she's like, no, silly. You know what I'm talking about. Where is the patriarch? Immediately, the guy starts sweating and he's like, I can't tell you that. And she's like, can't or won't? And although he doesn't directly say this, it's made apparent to us as the audience that he's physically incapable of revealing that information. The patriarch won't allow it. She's like, that's okay. I can just pull the information out of you. Now, I'm not gonna lie to you, this scene was pretty gross, so I'm gonna kind of abridge it here. She uses her psychic abilities to make the guy forcefully shove his own hand down his throat, pushing it deeper and deeper until it's all the way up to the elbow. And then she snaps her fingers and makes him rip out a handful of his own guts. Now somehow, during this disgusting display, she's able to extract the information from him psychically. And when it's all said and done, she tells the Marines that they needed to go to the Cathedral of the Bounteous Harvest. It was there that they would find the Patriarch. Now, back up in orbit, Xantine has just received word of the believed location of the enemy leadership, so him and the rest of the Hidden Blade, including the Terminator Quartermaster Zarquil and an absolute unit named Lordling, as well as a handful of other Marines, board Xantine's Dreadclaw and prepare to make planetfall. Now, I should point out that Lordling is a strange individual. He's kind of like a Chaos Ogryn, but far more childlike and 10 times more demented. Now, apparently, he was a Space Marine once, but quickly outgrew his armor. Now, pieces of that armor are held in place across his body by a series of leather straps. Xantine doesn't know their origin for sure, but knowing Lordling's predilections, he guessed they were probably human. Xantine asks Lordling if he's comfortable, and the giant responds with a bunch of gurgling nonsense, saliva foaming in the corners of his mouth in anticipation for the slaughter to come. He never was much for conversation. They feel the Dreadclaw being released from their ship, and shortly thereafter, they can hear the fizzle coming from outside, indicative that they had entered Serene's atmosphere. Soon Xantine would be standing under a new sky on a new world, one that he would make perfect. The drop pod crashed through the roof of the massive cathedral, its landing doors immediately unfurling like the petals of an obscene flower. Before the cultists inside could respond, their first wave was obliterated by a booming cacophony of bolter shells that ripped from the interior of the pod. Now, at the exact same time that the Hidden Blade is attacking the interior of the cathedral, a quarter of a mile away, Vavisk and Tarakon's squad, now bolstered by the remnants of the Planetary Guard, are assaulting the front gates in a two-pronged attack. Lordling charged out of the pod, wielding a giant electrically charged Zweihander, with several smaller Marines in purple armor following up behind him. The sight of him was horrifying. He loped forward like a deranged predator. A huge rictus smile spread across his face as he swung the massive blade back and forth, every swing bisecting scores of cultists. As he slaughtered the enemy, he laughed with childlike glee, bringing his weapon down again and again. After this, Sarquil and Xantine joined the fight, Xantine picking off targets with his pistol, the Pleasures of the Flesh, while Sarquil's chain cannon roared to life, obliterating high-valued targets while leaving the rest to Lordling and the others. He was always a stickler for conserving ammunition. It was as if the cathedral was a massive hornet's nest that had been kicked by the Emperor's children. Pure strain gene stealers began pouring in from every direction, crawling out of the pipes and through grates in the flooring. Xantine was not concerned with them. He scanned the area trying to pinpoint the foe's leader figure. Now eventually, he spotted a bald-headed woman that bore the telltale markings of a witch and assumed that she was in control. She could sense the presence of something else, something far more ancient and terrifying. Whatever it was working its way through the pipe system and was headed right for them. The entire time that Xantine is fighting through waves of cultists, he can feel Serjanth getting more and more freaked out by whatever it is she thinks is in the pipes. She's screaming in his mind for him to run, and he's like, I need you to chill and let me go back to killing. But then all of a sudden, he feels this catastrophic pressure in his head, and above him, he sees one of the pipes get ripped apart from within, 4 clawed hands grabbing the surface before an enormous gene stealer, larger than he had ever seen, leapt out to greet him. The Patriarch had finally shown itself. Seeing an opportunity to steal glory for himself, the closest Space Marine to the Patriarch lifted his power sword in 2 hands and charged. But the Patriarch didn't even look at him. Its tail whipped out like the crack of a whip, stabbing him in the chest and flooding his body with alien poison, killing him instantly. The only thought going through Xantine's mind is, my god, I have to remember to collect a sample of that stuff. Sarquil levels his chain cannon at it, but Xantine turns to him and he's like, are you nuts, man? Have some decorum. That creature was obviously his to kill. The Terminator looks at him with a look of both annoyance and an utter lack of surprise. And he's just like, by all means then, and turns around to go after some gene stealers that were trying to flank them. He leveled his sword at the monster and issued his challenge.
I am Xantine, magnificence of the adored and paragon of the perfect third. You may have brute strength, but I have killed 1,000 of your kind. Come, that I may kill you and make this world my own.
Being this close to the Patriarch is causing Serjanth to go absolutely mental in his mind. She's screaming at him to run over and over, and he's just like, would you just shut up already? I'm motherfucking Xantine. There is no foe I cannot kill. He turns back to the creature, but it's not where it was a second ago. It's inches away from him. The Patriarch backhanded him so hard that he was sent flying through the air and then spiraling across the cathedral floor into a pile of collapsed masonry. Having not been impressed by Xantine in any way, shape, or form, the Patriarch turns around and attacks the other Marines. The blow had sent his mind reeling, not just because of how strong the Patriarch was, but it was amplified by the psychic pressure that it generated. He leapt to his feet and by instinct adopted a Kamosian dueling stance. He recollected himself and watched as more of the Planetary Guard and Gene Stealer cultists flooded into the cathedral, engulfing the entire thing in a vicious melee. Having recovered, he shouts out to the Patriarch, finally, a worthy foe. The thing turned back to him and stalked forward, slowly this time, taking a moment to size him up. It was wary of him, and that was good. Suddenly, the Patriarch leapt at him, its talons extended for a decapitating strike, but Xantine feinted to the left and thrust his blade two-handed upwards towards its throat. It would have been the most perfect killing cut of all, but the thing twisted in midair, wrenching its body in an impossible way to dodge the strike, while simultaneously bringing one of its clawed hands down on his wrist, breaking his grip on his sword and sending it skittering across the floor. The creature struck again, and he was forced to parry with his vambraces. Now realizing that there's no way for him to run away, Sir Janth implores Xantine to let her take control, but he denies her. This is a battle that he needed to win on his own. He brought his pistol to bear and buried 3 shots in the Patriarch's chest, but the mass reactive rounds pinged off of its dense chitin and ricocheted into the depths of the cathedral. Xantine could hear distant screams as they exploded amongst human and Xenos bodies alike. The creature was relentless, striking again and again and again. Like all Emperor's children, Xantine had been trained extensively in blade work, and without his sword, he was vulnerable. But the duelist stance was adept at dodging and parrying even without a sword. Even still, it was inevitable that he wouldn't be able to dodge all of them. And sure enough, eventually, one of the creature's clawed strikes found its mark and ripped through his pauldron, digging deep into flesh and bone. The pain was white hot, like exposure to a miniature sun. He roared and rolled with the blow, the movement softening the impact just enough to avoid his arm being completely severed. At this point, Xantine is realizing that he may have bit off more than he can chew. So he opens the Vox link to his allies, but they're not going to be able to help them. Tarakon and Vavisk are still dealing with the enemies at the gate, who have now been galvanized by the Patriarch's arrival, and Sarquil basically just laughs at him. He's like, "Oh no, my lord, I wouldn't possibly want to interfere with your glorious victory. That wouldn't be very honorable, would it?" Xantine calls him a bastard and cuts the link. He was on his own, though technically speaking, he was never really completely alone. He looked back up at the creature, but it was gone. And in that exact same moment, he felt enormous pain erupt across his back as a hammer strike from the Patriarch hit him so hard that it shattered the casing of his backpack's power core and knocked him to the ground. Now, although Sir Janth was completely freaked out by this thing before, now she's starting to come around. Every single time that Xantine takes a hit and feels pain, she in turn feels it as well. And as a demon of the god of excess, this is like a drug to her that causes her to not only become more powerful, but to start to desire more carnage and bloodshed. The creature reached down and picked Xantine up by the head, cradling it carefully at first like a mother would hold a baby, before violently slamming it down, smashing skin and skull against the stone floor. It did it again and again and again, rapidly smashing Xantine's head down into the stone. Eventually, it pulled him back up and looked into his bloodshot eyes. The thing was grossly proportioned, a walking nightmare, a hideous, malformed attempt at perfection. It disgusted him. Through foaming blood in his mouth, he told the monster to savor its last breath. And finally, he relented and let the demon in. The pain was gone, replaced with a loving warmth. She wanted to take his body. She wanted to take him over completely, but she couldn't. Not yet. So instead, they shared it, joining their power together. And together, they were so very powerful. The Patriarch was fast, but they were faster. It whipped out a talon, slashing for their throat, but their arm shot forward to grab it in mid-flight with minimal exertion. Xantine looked at the creature through new eyes, taking in an impossible amount of detail in an instant. He could see the distinct ridges and whorls in its chitin, an individual fingerprint for a creature of a hive mind. He could feel its throbbing, corrosive blood under its skin. He could smell its stink of sewers and filth, both human and Xenos. Xantine sees it now as she sees it, a framework of sensation, rough and smooth, light and dark, pleasure and pain. He gently placed his other hand on the Patriarch's arm, testing the weight and tensile strength of Xenos biology, and with a violent wrench, he tore it in half. The monster screamed in pain, and Xantine drunk it in, the suffering strange and pure like a fine wine. It spun away from him, leaving its severed limb in his grip. Xantine took the opportunity to collect his rapier from the floor. The creature lunged for him again, but he deftly dodged out of the way and stabbed it in the armpit. Following through on the momentum, Xantine reached out and grabbed the creature's other arm, wrapping it around himself in a mockery of an embrace, before spinning loose and tearing the limb from its joint. In the same spinning motion, he let it loose, sending the arm spinning through the air, trailing out a stream of caustic gore into a mass of cultists. The Patriarch recovered, turning back to charge at its foe like a loping canid. It leapt into the air, but before it could get a hold of its prey, it was struck mid-flight in the side by a wave of sonic force. The open blade had finally arrived, and Vavik and the Noise Marines had opened up on it. The surprise hit was not enough to kill the creature, but it was enough to disorient it and throw it off its guard. Xantine slid smoothly to intercept it. Holding his rapier in two hands, he impaled the Patriarch through its fanged mouth, its monomolecular blade forcing its way down the monster's throat, slicing through muscle, tissue, and major organs on its journey into the creature's guts. He pushed the blade further still, out through the creature's belly, and brought it down to the cathedral floor, pinning it in place like a massive insect. In panic and hatred, it flailed and clawed at him, but Xantine avoided its swipes so expertly that they seemed to be divorced from reality. It would be simple enough now to kill this thing. He could just put his pistol to its eye and pull the trigger. But Serjanth, drunk on pain and pleasure, wanted more. She wanted to prolong this pleasure. She didn't want to just murder the monstrosity, she wanted to ruin it completely, destroying everything that it was and everything it represented to demonstrate her superiority, her own perfection. Xantine picked up a makeshift blade in the rubble that one of the cultists had lost during the melee, and with a detached sense from his own body, watched as Serjanth took control and began to tear the Patriarch down piece by piece, drinking in its alien pain like nectar. By the time she was done, it was a mewling thing, bleeding and weak. Her art had a brutal effect on the Patriarch's flock. Before they had been so galvanized by its arrival, but now each and every one of them held their skulls and screamed in horror as the psychic reverberations from their leader washed out over each and every one of them, the transmitted pain driving them mad. They hurled themselves at Xantine and the Space Marines. They ran shrieking, wild-eyed, lashing out with crude clubs and blunt blades. Others staggered around the cathedral as if suddenly waking from a nightmare, their eyes wide, their mission forgotten. They were easy kills for the Space Marines. Her feasting complete, the demon shrank back into herself, and once again, Xantine was in full control. He heard Vavisk's voice in his ear over the Vox, telling him that the enemy had broken. The survivors were running into the sewers underneath the city. Xantine tells them to let them flee, let them return to their holes, and tell their squalid vermin of me, of my magnificence. He stepped to the top of a pile of corpses and raised his arms aloft.
I am Xantine,
he bellowed, loud enough to rattle the broken glass in what was left of the huge windows.
And I have saved this world!
He could hear cheering from outside. Word had spread quickly throughout Serene that real living angels had descended from the stars and ended the rebellion. All of the citizens began moving through the streets towards the cathedral, desperate to catch a glimpse of the Emperor's own sons. Xantine could hear their murmuring, and when he stepped out into the midday sun to greet the people of Serene, the crowd erupted into roars of adulation. He basked in it, allowing their praise to salve his wounds and soothe his strained muscles. He waved his hand to silence them.
Good citizens of Serene, your ordeal is over.
Several of the other Marines dragged out the bald-headed witch from before and dropped her at his feet. He picked her up by the scruff of the neck and held her out to the crowd like a game bird.
Gaze upon your would-be conqueror. This wretch has laid low your great city. This Xenos filth, this monstrosity, this weakling. Many thousands of you have laid down your lives today, but I command you, do not remember this day as one of death, nor sadness, nor grief.
He spun and cast a gloved finger out at the crowd, commanding them.
No, you must remember this day as one of rebirth. This world will rise from the ashes. Remember this day as one of power, as together we excised and destroyed the cancer at Serene's heart. And remember this day as one of glory.
Xantine threw his arms wide, anguish clutched in one hand.
because this day brought me to Serene.
He brought it down on the alien's neck, her hairless head bouncing as it hit the marble, staining the white stone red. The cheers were loud enough to shake the ground that Xantine stood upon. After this, he was near carried to Serene's Senate, swept along by a parade of grateful humanity.
Please, Lord, what is your name?
I am Xantine,
the warlord said, and the word carried like a virus through the herd until it was screamed by dozens, hundreds. Xantine had heard his name on the lips of mortals before. They had cursed it, or screamed it, or groaned it as they died by his hand. It had been a long time since he had heard his name spoken like this. They screamed it in ecstasy and issued thunderous applause. Xantine drank it all in like a narcotic. One young woman pressed through the crowd, holding out a bouquet of flowers to him. With an overly dramatic bow, Xantine accepted them. Eventually, the cheering parade made its way to a set of great wooden doors that swung open in greeting to Xantine and the rest of the Emperor's children. The royal guards held the bleeding crowds back as the warriors entered the chamber. It was here that the ruling class had gathered in their hundreds in a massive banquet hall to greet their saviors and treat them to a feast fit for kings and queens. The Astartes took their place at the massive table before them, Xantine sitting at its head. The Marines were treated to every delicacy available on Serene: exotic wines, rare game birds, tidbits of luxury unimaginable to the cheering crowds outside. But to Xantine, an individual who had savored a galaxy's worth of sensation, it was all rather dull. Eventually, a pudgy little man approached Xantine and introduced himself as Piero. He tells him that he had met the other Marines already, but this was the first time being face to face. It had been Piero who called out to him in the first place. Xantine nodded in approval, thanking him for letting him know about Serene. The world truly was beautiful. Before they can converse any further, a round of applause spreads throughout the room, and all of the nobles give a standing ovation. Xantine turned his head, and at the far end of the hall, atop an ornate staircase, an old man dressed in finery took his seat on a large ornate throne. The planetary governor had arrived. Xantine tapped Piero on the shoulder and told him that he wanted to speak with the governor. Piero tells him, of course, he would make the necessary preparations and get a meeting scheduled as soon as possible. But Xantine tells him that he misunderstands. He was going to speak to him now. Now, Piero has been trying to get a meeting for himself with the governor for over a decade, and despite his position as vice treasurer, it still never happened. But as he thinks about it, he's like, that was before, when he was just Piero. Now, he was Piero, the caller of angels. A smile spread across his face, and he adjusted his belt before telling Xantine to follow him. The scene jumps ahead, and Xantine is standing before the governor. Now, the old man is clearly intimidated by him, but declares that everyone in attendance should give a toast to their new saviors. The nobles do so, and the governor turns back to him, speaking loudly so that all in attendance could hear the conversation.
1,000 thanks for your efforts today, Xantine, child of the Emperor. Truly, the Emperor smiles on us to send his most exotic warriors to our aid. These are dark times when mankind is riven across the stars. But your blessed presence reminds us of Serene's importance to the Imperium. Did you know, there's a legend on this world of a savior who will return from the heavens in our hour of need to lead us to glory. Superstition, of course. Our only savior is the Emperor on Terra. But your arrival reminds me of the story and warms my heart. Truly, you have saved us. Please, he said, bowing slightly, convey our thanks to the Lords of Terra when you leave.
Leave?
Xantine said, echoing the governor. It became a question as it rolled over his tongue. He thought of Vavisk outside with his noise marines, standing ready to level key structures in the city. He was just waiting for the signal. He thought also of Lordling, leading his slave masters into the city warrens of residential streets, licking his slit lips at the thought of corralling thousands of humans into the ship's pens. He thought of Sarkwell, already dispassionately counting the spoils of this ransacked planet, its art and culture and beauty rendered down into their constituent parts for mindless consumption. And finally, he thought of the fallen figures outside, toppled things of masonry and human meat, the remnants of a world striving for some appreciation of perfection in an ugly galaxy, a world that appreciated him. He would not make the same mistakes again. He would make it right this time, make it perfect.
Why would we leave?
The governor thought that this was a joke and let out a hearty chuckle, but then silence spanned, and he realized that Xantine wasn't joking. He asked him what he meant.
Why, my decision to stay on this world should come as no surprise to you, my good man. Your story was prophecy, one that I now fulfill. I have come from the heavens to your world, and I have found it lacking. But I will not destroy it. I will save it. Rejoice, for Xantine has come.
But my lord,
the governor said, a confused smile still flickering on his lips.
These statues, the savior, these are myths. I am the governor of Serene,
he said, voice finally hardening as he realized the gravity of the situation.
My family was chosen by our blessed emperor to serve his interests. We alone have the right to rule the citizens of this most valuable world.
Xantine asks him if his rule is so absolute, how did his own people rise up against him? To which the governor spits. Those weren't people. They were dwellers of the Undercity, citizens in name alone. Xantine tells him that they seem to disagree. He turned away from the governor and cast his gaze out at the gathered nobles and power-hungry social climbers.
I have decided to stay on this world to guide it into perfection. Serene has been failed by its leaders. Its people deserve a leader of character, of honor, of skill. You are a decadent and ineffectual collection of dilettantes who deserve nothing more than the glory of death at the tip of my sword. Only Piero here had the presence of mind and quickness of wit to aid his planet, his people. As such, he will serve as my governor, my representative in matters of state, as I preside over the creation of a just society.
Him?
The governor sputtered.
Incredulous. He is nothing. I'm a puffed-up secretary. You cannot replace me. I simply won't allow it.
He pointed a trembling hand at the giant.
Guards, arrest this thing.
4 guards started to move in towards him, and with lightning-quick speed, Xantine drew his pistol and shot each one of them dead, their skulls opening up and brain matter splashing out on the robes and gowns of the banquet attendees. He approached the governor and trailed a finger down his cheek, whispering to him theatrically, yet still loud enough for everyone to hear.
My dear, your own people have turned against you. A ruler must be loved. Listen to the crowds outside. They do not love you. They love me. How could I let you remain in power?
You rule us? This is madness. Why would you come from the heavens to save us just to subjugate our world?
Xantine backhanded him so hard that it twisted the man's head and ripped it loose from his neck, launching upwards from his shoulder as if it was taking off for orbit. He turned to the Senate. All looked on in silent horror, unable to move. Xantine pointed out to the doors and shouted to open them. The soldiers in attendance looked at each other, unsure of what to do, until they saw him raise his gun again. This time, the message was clear, and they moved to do as they were told. The crowds were still cheering outside, their excitement somehow growing even louder as they realized that the doors were opening for them.
Citizens of Serene,
Xantine roared.
I throw open the doors of this celebration to you. Please join us in our feast.
A cheer convulsed through the crowd as the people of Serene chanted Xantine's name. The crowds came pouring in to the horror of the gathered nobles. They filled the space like water, filling corridors, walkways, climbing up stairs, and overturning tables as they went. They stared wide-eyed at the insane luxury on display, as some of them grabbed feverishly at the food carried by the servants, while others tried to engage Senate members in boisterous conversations. Others still sat in luxurious chairs designed for occupants of high breeding. The raw shock and disgust that the nobles felt was akin to being surrounded by vermin. The very idea that one of the common folk would ever approach them, let alone being surrounded like this, was unthinkable. Others were still in shock from the governor's brutal execution, their lives of luxury rendering them incapable of dealing with this new reality. Xantine lifted the governor's limp body and kicked it down the stairs before returning to sit upon his new throne and address his new subjects.
The people of Serene deserve a better world. You deserve a better world. I will deliver it to you. Weep today for your pain, but be glad that your pain brought me to Serene, because I will bring a new society, a just society, a perfect society.
The chorus began anew, the crowd screaming his name. Xantine smiled. It filled his hearts to hear it. Although this is the end of the video, it's technically only halfway through Xantine's story, as there's a whole second part to the novel that this comes from. In the second half, there's a bit of a time jump, and Xantine becomes the supreme ruler of Serene. He sets up all kinds of crazy laws and begins to mold its society to his image. So let me know if you want me to do a follow-up to this video where I cover the rest of it. If you want more abridged Warhammer stories like this one, I'll have a playlist linked here in the end screen with a whole bunch of them. Now personally, as most of you know, I'm a big fan of spooky things, so most of them are horror related, but there's some in there that I thought were just particularly interesting stories that I wanted more people to know about. Also, if you want to know more about the Emperor's Children, and specifically the Noise Marines, I did a pretty substantial deep dive into them a while back that I'll link here as well. It's definitely worth checking out if you're interested in the Emperor's Children. Anyways, big thanks to everyone who supports the work that I do, and I will catch you all in the next one.